Touch the leg. Today, as we see growing injustices, abuses, exploitation, and power struggles, rays of hope and inspiration come from individuals who strive for the protection and realization of the rights and freedom of the downtrodden, minorities, neglected, and repressed. Our today's guests are two such individuals, John Billington and Drew Pavlou. John Billington is former chairman of the Tibet Society, probably the oldest and the first organization to have formed to support Tibet's right to self-determination and draw attention to the plight of Tibet since its brutal occupation by the Communist Party of China. John, a friend of Tibet and a human rights activist, has traveled to places, spoke and wrote for the rights of the Tibetans. And many of us know Drew Pavlou for standing up against the growing transnational aggression of the Chinese Communist Party and raising his voice against China's human rights abuses in Tibet and East Turkestan. We have seen him engage in a campaign to move the 2022 Winter Olympic Games from Beijing to elsewhere, citing the persecution of Tibetans, Uyghurs, and Taiwanese people. Drew, John, welcome to Tibet TV.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
John, so Tibet Society was formed in the year 1959.
That's right.
The year when the world saw the mass exodus of Tibetans from Tibet, into exile, and the year when His Holiness the Dalai Lama was forced to India. Yeah. From early on, the society strived to work towards promotion of Tibet's independence and to inform the world of the sufferings of the Tibetans under the oppressive regime. And it has provided vital support for Tibetan rehabilitation. So, John, could you briefly tell us your experience of working with the Tibetan community?
Well, actually, I didn't know about the Tibet Society until about 1978. I was working in India as a teacher from 1958 to 1964. And part of this time I was working in Darjeeling. I visited Darjeeling in 1959, the year His Holiness escaped, and with his followers via Tawang. So Darjeeling was full of Tibetans who had come across the border. Some of them were refugees, but many of them were members of the Chashijang group, and they were going back to Tibet to fight the Chinese. I was teaching at the time in Bombay. When my time in Bombay finished, I took a job in Darjeeling so that I was very close to the Tibetan community. So I knew what was going on very closely, and I met people like Dawa Nobu, who was at the Tibetan Refugee Center. Then in 1964, I went back to the UK, but I still continued to support Tibet and to keep in touch. Then in 1978, a British communist member by the name of Felix Green, who was a great supporter of Beijing and the Communist Party, he produced a beautiful film which was shown on British TV, showing Tibetans to be wonderfully happy under Chinese rule. I knew that this was complete rubbish. So I wrote a very forceful letter to one of our national newspapers saying that the film was a complete fantasy and this was not what it was like in Tibet. I had read the International Commission of Jurists report on Tibet in 1960. So I knew that the International Commission of Jurists had found the Chinese guilty of genocide. That is what they said. They are guilty of genocide against Tibetans. So I put all this information in the newspaper. Now, at the time, this was almost unknown. And people in the UK knew nothing about Tibet. They hadn't heard of the International Commission of Jurists report. So all that was new information. As a result of, the newspaper gave me 36 inches of space. That is huge publicity. As a result of that, the Tibet Society wrote to me and asked me if I would join. So I didn't find them, they found me. So that is how I came to be interested. Then I became a member of the Tibet Society, and I was very active. And I was always trying to think of how we can help Tibet. And you may be interested to know that it was I, in 1983, who first put forward the idea that we should campaign to get the Nobel Peace Prize for His Holiness.
Yes.
So this is how I was involved. And I was it was long before the age of the mass media we have now. You know, things move more slowly back in the 1960s and 70s. But that is how I got involved, and I was very heavily involved. That's enough for the moment.
And also Tibet Society was behind the, making it materialize His Holiness's visit to Britain.
Yes. I was myself one of the ones. I invited His Holiness to Britain in 1996. And he spoke at the Alexandra Palace, and he spoke in Manchester. And we had press releases, and we had the British press, you know. So we did everything we could to give it maximum publicity. And he also spoke on other occasions in the Albert Hall and so forth. So we did everything we could. And up until the 1990s, up to about 1996, the British public was relatively well informed about Tibet. But it took a lot of education. You know, we had to educate the British public because they didn't know about Tibet. It was a small number of people trying to tell them what's going on. Unfortunately, what happened was the Chinese, of course, opened up Tibet to tourism in the 1980s. And the Chinese were hoping that the tourists would sort of support China's colonial rule. But the opposite happened. All the tourists supported Tibet. So what did the Chinese do? They stopped tourism. Because tourism is counterproductive. It's criticizing China instead of saying that China's done a good job. So this is what happened. So sometime after 1996, it became increasingly difficult for tourists or reporters to get into Tibet. I have to say, and I regret it, the Chinese have been very successful in keeping the lid on information. And I am very sorry to say, and I tell this to Drew because he is young and can do something, that the British public is now less well informed than it was 20 years ago. You know, we have gone backwards.
Yes.
So this is where you have to work hard to inform people again, you know. I will do what I can, but I'm old. So it has become more difficult. I mean, I still write letters to the newspaper about Tibet, but they don't publish them as much as they did, because no one is interested in Tibet. They're interested at the moment in the Uyghurs, in Xinjiang, you know, that monopolizes the interest. So it is more difficult at the moment. However, I am optimistic.
Right. So like John said, it has become more difficult nowadays to inform, to let people know about what's happening inside China, what is China doing in the places it has occupied. So Drew, tell us about, the growing influences of Chinese Communist Party in Australia, in the West especially, and particularly in Australia, this transnational aggression of the Communist Party of China. How is it impacting the Australian people and its government and Australia as a country?
Yes. Thank you so much for having me on. And John, thank you. It is tremendously inspirational to meet someone and listen to someone who has dedicated almost 6 decades to the cause. And if it takes me 6 decades, we obviously hope and pray that the oppression will end sometime soon. But if it takes 6 decades, I'm prepared to potentially be here when I'm 86 as well. It is a difficult situation. I completely agree with John that unfortunately it seems like awareness of atrocities in Tibet has actually gone backwards for the Western public in many countries. It has really gone backwards over the past few decades. This is something that almost prompted me to begin my protests. I was upset and frustrated with the hypocrisy I felt of many Western political leaders and business leaders, especially in Australia where China is our top trading partner. I was upset, frustrated, angry at the hypocrisy where people would speak about human rights all over the world, but it seemed that inside China, they didn't want to touch the issue, especially in Australia where we have the largest, it is our largest trading partner. It is worth hundreds of billions of dollars to the Australian economy every single year. And, Australia's richest people depend upon the mining interests. The universities are so reliant upon international student fees. This is what kind of prompted my protest. I was angry and frustrated at the hypocrisy of many of the Western political and business leaders who were willing to criticise human rights abuses all across the world, but they had a big blind spot when it came to Tibet, the Uyghurs, the Hong Kongers, the Chinese. It's true, John. I mean, at the moment, there is a lot more coverage of the Uyghur. There's a lot more coverage of the Uyghur issue in Western press. The way I have always seen it from the start of my protest back in 2019, I was 20 years old when I began. I've always seen these issues and these struggles as fundamentally interconnected. The struggle in Tibet, the struggle for the Uyghurs, the struggle for the Hong Kongers, the Taiwanese, all the minorities across China who face brutality, and even the Chinese people themselves who are victims of the Chinese Communist Party and its rule. I've always believed that these struggles are interconnected, and I've always felt that it's so much more powerful when we can all try and unite and unite across these cross-cultural groups. And that is something that we've seen really beautiful. I think we saw something very beautiful in the campaign against the Beijing Winter Olympics. The Tibetan groups, Students for Free Tibet, a lot of these young Tibetan groups were working with the Uyghurs and the Hong Kongers and Taiwanese and people all across the world in a burgeoning, alliance of freedom. And that was also the idea behind the political party we started in Australia, which we didn't win any seats, but I think maybe we're a bit ahead of our time. But the idea of the party was to bring together the Uyghur community in Australia, the Tibetan community in Australia, the Hong Konger community in Australia, Taiwanese Australians, Chinese Australians who believe in democracy and freedom and stand against the Chinese Communist Party and its rule, bringing together all these groups and standing against the growing business, political links between our countries and the Chinese Communist Party's regime, because we don't want to be complicit in the crimes. We want to have a hard line between us and the Communist Party. We should not be complicit in these crimes. We should not be supporting them, strengthening them through trade, through massive amounts of Western investment. We should not be strengthening a regime that targets the families of innocents, that commits genocide and carries out brutal crimes against humanity. This is how it started for me. I started out protesting against the Confucius Institute at my university, the University of Queensland. We didn't know, but my university had a $300 million a year relationship with China, 9,000 international students from China every year, and that represented up to 1/5 of the university's budget. And so when we started protesting against the university's Confucius Institute, which is an institute that was run by the Chinese government, and it taught propaganda, Chinese propaganda lines when it came to Uyghurs, Tibetans, Hong Kongers. When we protested against that, we faced a lot of backlash. I was beaten up by supporters of the Chinese government on campus, Chinese students who supported the regime in China. They tried to assault us. The university took their side, and the Chinese Consul General in Brisbane put out a statement endorsing the violence as patriotic. And he was actually appointed by the university as an honorary professor. And so when the Chinese government endorsed violence against me as a separatist, and they encouraged people to attack me, I received hundreds of death threats against my family. And the Chinese state media started running articles urging the University of Queensland to try expel me. And so the University of Queensland, because of the really important because of the massive financial links with China, they ended up spending up to $500,000 trying to expel me as a student permanently. They brought in some of the best law firms in Australia to do that, to slander me, to go after me, and I was only 21 years old. That was the start of my experience. I learned the hard way about just how brutal this regime can be, even if you're a Westerner. This is something that I try and remind people. My story got a lot of coverage in the West because I'm Australian, but Tibetan Australians, Uyghur Australians, Hong Konger Australians, they face intimidation in Australia too, and often their stories aren't heard. I helped lead the Peng Shuai campaign at the Australian Open in Wimbledon this year. The Chinese tennis player that was kidnapped by the Chinese government after she accused one of the senior officials of rape, and that was such a clear example of the Chinese government using its economic influence to try and silence these sporting organisations in a clear case where this poor woman was basically erased from existence. Her existence was erased by the Chinese government, and the Chinese government expected the entire world to look the other way because of its financial interests. And I was sickened by that. We helped lead the campaign there. Lately, the Chinese government has been quite brutal in going after me and my family. Even just in the past week, I've been receiving emails that contain bounty threats against me, urging people to kill me and my family members for money. What I have faced is absolutely nothing compared to the struggles of the Tibetan people, the Uyghurs, the Hong Kongers, all the people who suffer under the brutality of the Chinese Communist Party. This is just a small slither, a small fraction of the brutality that they have faced. Every single one of my Uyghur friends has family members in concentration camps. Every single one of my Tibetan friends in Australia knows family members that were tortured by the Chinese police, knows family members who were political prisoners. All my friends in Australia who are from a Tibetan background, the vast majority, trekked over the Himalayas as young kids. Their parents sent them across the Himalayas, this dangerous journey as kids, because that is how desperate the situation is in Tibet right now. There are people who've burnt themselves alive because they are that hopeless under Chinese Communist Party oppression and rule. The oppression inside Tibet is so brutal that hundreds of people have burnt themselves alive, one of the most painful deaths imaginable. That is how brutal the situation is inside Tibet right now. So my whole goal and what I've been trying to do over the past 3.5, 4 years, try and, through my protests, raise awareness for the Tibetans, the Uyghurs, the Hong Kongers, the people in charge, the Chinese people who are oppressed, and do my best to form alliances and connections across the different communities, the Tibetans, the Uyghurs, the Hong Kongers, and do my best to bring information about this oppression to the young generation, because as John is completely correct, it's sad. The situation has gone back 20, 30 years in terms of awareness. When China grew to this new economic heft, when China grew in economic size, suddenly the conversation shut down, and all these potential allies then forgot about the cause. This is the hypocrisy I'm trying to fight against.
It's very heartwarming to hear and know that individuals like you both have their determination, have grown stronger evermore, right?
Absolutely.
So John, you have been working with the Tibetan community for like 6 decades now. You have seen the evolution of the exiled Tibetan community, and we're witnessing the ever-growing presence of China in the global market. It's political antagonism, and it's the aggression, transnational aggression, and it's trying to influence everybody in every country. So at this point of time, how do you see the Tibetan freedom movement, the status of it?
I'm very optimistic. I congratulate Drew. What I've heard is very encouraging. But I think times are encouraging also.
Yes.
I think we have reached a very critical point where the 3 greatest dictatorships in the world, Iran, Russia, and China. In that order, China is the biggest, followed by Russia and Iran. These are the 3 biggest dictatorships in the world. All 3 are under pressure from their own populations.
Amen.
Women in Iran, 50% of the country, and some of the men want more freedom. People in Russia know that they've been cheated and deceived, and a tremendous waste of human life on a completely pointless war. And they will rebel against Putin. And people in China are rebelling against the years of restriction and restraint and surveillance that they've been subject to. So there is now growing demand for democracy all throughout the big dictatorships. And there is a great opportunity here. The one thing I said to His Holiness when I saw him a few days ago is, we must support democracy wherever there is a call for it. That is Tibet's best hope. That is the hope, and I think we are almost at a turning point now.
Absolutely.
So I am optimistic. Together we will do it.
Yes, I'm so optimistic. Absolutely the same, John.
I'll just say
What an amazing time.
one last thing. The Chinese bought with their money. They bought popularity with the West, but they have finally been found out,
Yes.
and the mood has turned against them.
Absolutely.
So that's the encouraging thing.
Yes.
Okay. And at this point of time, it is very important for the leaders of the country to come together, and then they call on to China to respect human rights of the people they're ruling. So, Drew, what currently the Australian government and its people, how is their way of perceiving the Tibetan freedom movement?
Yes. Look, very unfortunate in the sense that I think the Australian government has not done almost anything for the Tibetans, has barely spoken up for Tibetans. And the encouraging thing is that the Australian people are far out ahead of the government in terms of recognition of the terrible human rights abuses inside China. People are learning more and more about Tibet, the Uyghurs, the Hong Kongers. Unfortunately, we're at a state where we have a new government in Australia, and this government has said almost all the right things about human rights and not backing down on our values, and not trading our values in return for, better relations with China. However, if you look in practice, unfortunately, it does seem that the government is very hopeful. It's pushing very hard for better relations with China. If you look at the Times actually suit us. The uprising in Iran, that is so inspirational. And you're seeing people inside China rise up as well. And, there's a growing call for democracy. There's a growing call against dictatorship. In all three of the big, brutal dictatorships, the people are rising up. And this is the greatest hope for Tibet. This is the greatest hope for all the oppressed and colonized peoples. These dictatorships are on the ropes. And we've just got to push. We've got to push. This is perhaps the best opportunity we've had in years, in decades really. Maybe the best opportunity since the fall of the Soviet Union, the best opportunity for the realization of democracy and freedom on a greater scale on the planet. And so we've got to push.
We agree on that completely.
Yes,
completely.
Absolutely. Unfortunately, the Australian government, it is trying to obtain better relations with China, and I worry that in the process they may sell out human rights concerns. They haven't spoken about the Tibetans. They've barely spoken about the Uyghurs. They've barely said anything about the Hong Kongers. I'm very worried that the new Labor government in Australia may put better relations with China ahead of these human rights concerns. This is what I'm worried about. But this time is ending. This time is ending. More and more people are waking up, and Xi Jinping has ripped the veil off. And people are standing up, and this is where there's a great inspirational moment, and we've just got to push.
Yeah, that's a bright side too. And on the brighter side, the new British government, the Prime Minister Rishi Sunak has said that China poses a systemic challenge to UK's values and its interest. And he said the golden era of UK-China is over. Does it look like the UK will take a stronger stand against the rising China? Do we see any positive development?
Yes, I think it will. It is a question of education. We have to educate our own people, including our own representatives, our MPs, in what is going on. Now, there is a battle here between greed, human greed, and morality. Human greed is a very powerful force. People want to buy goods cheap, and cheap goods are made in China. So this is the big problem. Throughout the world, everyone wants to buy cheap goods made in China, so we have to have good relationships with China. Morally, we condemn the regime. Yes. So it is our job, people who understand what is going on, we have to remind people that behind commerce, international commerce with China, there is morality and the way they treat people and the human rights situation. This is what we have to do. We have to keep pressing and reminding our leaders. But I am optimistic because I think for the first time in 70 years, since the Communist Party came to power, most people throughout the world have suffered at the hands of the Chinese in some way, at the sheer greed, at what the Chinese themselves called their wolf warrior diplomacy, their aggression to get their own way. And now the world is united and it is China that is isolated. So this is what we have to keep in mind, But I am optimistic for that reason.
Yes.
Yeah. But that also means that we have to keep pushing forward harder and stronger.
Yes.
And it is very encouraging to see you both, two very, good friends
in age.
Very good friends of Tibet, human rights advocate, with us today. It was very inspirational and encouraging talking with you both today.
All I want to say to end it is, in my lifetime, we will bring His Holiness the Dalai Lama back to Tibet.
I hope so. I hope so too.
Hopefully. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you
for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you
So much.
There was two political activists and friends of Tibet from two different generations, John Billington and Drew Pavlou. Thank you for watching In Conversation with Tibet TV.